2 Corinthians chapter 11. I wish that you would bear with me in a little foolishness, but indeed you are bearing with me. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. But I am afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you received a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. For I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. But even as if I am unskilled in speech, yet I am not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way we have made this evident to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything I have kept myself from being a burden to you, and will continue to do so. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you. God knows I do. But what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. Again I say, let no one think me foolish, but if you do, receive me even as foolish, so that I may also boast a little. What I am not saying as the Lord would, but as in foolishness, in this confidence of boasting. Since many boast according to the flesh, I will boast also. For you, being so wise, tolerate the foolish gladly. For you tolerate it if anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. To my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison. But in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I am just as bold myself. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and in hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is a daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? If I have to boast, I will boast of what pertains to my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the ethnarch under Aretas the king was guarding the city of the Damascenes in order to seize me. And I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, and so escaped his hands.
We come now to this 11th chapter in our study called Paul and the Corinthians. I'll remind you that Paul is the apostle, the pastor who established the church at Corinth. And no sooner he got it started and had moved on to some other places to establish new churches than others came behind him and promoted a false gospel, something that Paul could identify as a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel. Even though Paul was actively traveling, planting new churches, he made emergency visits back to Corinth to try to straighten this out. We've seen in the letter already that he had written to them numbers of times, including a very, very painful letter he wrote to them, correcting them, bringing firm correction to the people there. And as we've seen in our studies so far, most of the church repented and were happily restored to fellowship with Christ and with Paul. Some remained rebellious and disruptive. You've got to listen here. Most of them turned back to Christ, but there were still some who were rebellious and disruptive. They preferred to follow the false teachers. They preferred a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel. Some of these false teachers, listen, would come into town from time to time trying to gain new followers and trying to gain finances through their efforts. They set themselves up as what either others or maybe they themselves termed super apostles, something more eminent than Paul, something more amazing than everyday Bible-believing Christians. And they were a great danger. They were agents of Satan, really. In this chapter, Paul confronts the problem of the super apostles, and he begins by telling us something about this different gospel and goes on from there. In order to confront these false teachers, and I need you all to understand what's going on here. In order to confront the false teachers, Paul knows that he's going to have to come down to the level of a dad trying to straighten out a teenage rebellious kid, even if the teenager looks at him like he's out of his mind. Moms and dads, older moms and dads, have you ever sat down with an older youth and tried to explain to them the reality of life and they look at you like you had two heads? Paul says they think that he's out of his mind and he feels foolish trying to explain this to them. But he plunges forward because he knows the stakes are so high. Let's see what he says here. I hope you will put up with a little of my foolishness, but you are already doing that. I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. He is portraying himself in the mode of a godly father talking to a rebellious young person. He says, I hope you will put up with a little of my foolishness, verse 1. As you seem to think it is. You think that this is foolish. I hope you'll put up with this. You're already doing that, though, listening to foolish things, and this is meant to be ironic, probably by listening to real foolishness from false teachers. He says, you're putting up with lots of foolishness, so you can surely hear something from me. I am jealous for you, verse 2, with a godly jealousy. Yes, he says, I want your loyalty and your obedience, but it's not for Paul's sake, it's not for Paul's gain, but for their sake and for that of Jesus Christ. Let me see if I understand this with you. He says, I promised you to one husband, to Christ, verse 2, so that I might present you to him as a pure virgin. You see, Paul's position, you've got to understand this. Listen, he says his position is sort of like that of the parent of an older girl who is engaged to marry a godly man. Are you with me on this? She's engaged to marry some godly guy, and she's now busy on the side dating some worldly, ungodly man. And the father says, what are you doing? I'm supposed to walk you down the aisle to marry somebody who's righteous, and you are running around with something that's wrong. He says, my job is to present you to Christ as one that's pure. What are you doing? And then we think a little bit about this deceived young person. We come to verse 3. But I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. He says this false teaching, this twisting of the truth, is nothing less than something that comes from Satan. Even as Satan appeared to Eve and got the truth of God all twisted up so that eventually she believed it, he says that's what's happening to some of you. You're listening to these false teachers who come in and they use religious words and they say things that seem really attractive, and the next thing you know, you're believing something that isn't true at all. In recognizing these false teachings, he says there's several things we ought to understand about them. Verse 4, "For if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it easily enough." He says, it happens that I came to you and I preached to you the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you listened to that very, very clearly, and you claimed to receive and believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, and now others are coming along and bringing something which is different from that. Someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the one that was preached to you originally. And you say, well, how could you preach a different Jesus? There only is one Jesus. Friends, listen. In this world, there will be people who will come to you and they'll say something about who Jesus was, which will be something entirely different. They'll say, well, historically, we can't believe what the Bible teaches about Jesus. Instead, he was probably this way. And they begin to name off all kinds of things about Jesus. If you look at some presentation at Easter time, it's a TV show, it's a magazine article at the newsstand, it's some other thing, every one of them will present some different Jesus than the Jesus of the Bible. They say he was a really interesting man who was interested in spiritual things, but surely not God. They'll say he's one of many good connections to God, like lots of others. They'll say he is one who really wants you to be affirmed of whatever it is that you want. Whatever your feelings are, Jesus is for you, just whatever you want. Jesus is a model, they say, of love without any judgment, no heaven, no hell, just Jesus pouring out the love of God. Jesus is a supporter of certain economic or political movements. I've got to tell you, several years ago, one of our major political parties said, we need to consciously go to college campuses, even Christian college campuses, and present Jesus as a socialist, so that everyone can be led astray to think that his main job was bringing about an economic movement. Friends, Jesus will be presented to you as almost anything other than the Jesus of the Bible, and you need to stop and think, is this the Jesus that I read in the Bible? Is this the Jesus I originally heard preached and taught? Is this the Jesus I trusted for salvation? Is it? The people in Corinth were being deceived. You hear someone using religious talk and scriptures, but you receive a different spirit than the one that you received from Paul. You say, what kind of different spirit would this be? I can tell you the different kind of spirit. When speakers come, and whether it doesn't matter if it's somebody who is trying to sell you pots and pans, or someone who's trying to sell a comedy act, or somebody who's trying to bring a religious thing, that person will say, first of all, things that are meant to flatter you. You know how this goes. The speaker comes out and he's going to deliver a little comedy routine. And he says, oh, you're a wonderful audience. You're the greatest audience. Let me tell you about an audience I had just a week ago. Oh, they were awful. They didn't laugh at the right times and they didn't know anything. But you're a great audience. And all of a sudden you feel built up. Am I right about this? And after they flatter you a little bit, they work on your pride. And they say, you're kind of some of the smartest people I've met. Oh, you're just really amazing. I can't believe how discerning you are. And they work on your pride for a little while. And after the flattery and the pride, then they eventually get down to something where there is some cause, some way that they would like you to join in with what they themselves are doing. I have this thing I need you to donate to. I need this thing for you to purchase. I've got this thing for you to do on my behalf and behalf of the organization I represent. Is this the spirit of Jesus Christ? Is this the spirit of the Apostle Paul, coming and flattering people and building up their pride? Is that his spirit? He says, you are getting a different spirit. It's a different gospel. It's a different spirit. It's all rooted in, as he says at the end of verse 4, a different gospel from the one you expected, one that you accepted, that is, something that is a different gospel. You say, well, how can there be a different gospel? There's just the gospel of Christ. Through all of human history, there have been at least two major brands of gospels that are different from that. Either you have something which is more than the gospel of Jesus Christ, saying, well, sure, we get Jesus and the cross of Christ, but there's so much more. You need to fulfill these requirements and do these rituals and add to it these works of your own. That is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is more than that. And then there's others who would say, well, no, it's sort of less than that in effect. As you receive Jesus as Savior, never mind about anything regarding personal sin or rebellion against God. You're going to sort of tack that up as a little trophy and continue to live with you as the center of your whole life. Those two ways of going into one ditch or the other could be represented this way. There's the gospel of Jesus Christ, faith in Jesus Christ that transforms your life. Or you've got one of two other things. Either on the one side, and I'll go over to the right-hand side, you've got legalism, which is the error that says, if we don't do each of these things just right, we are not Christians. And this was an error that the Galatian church had. If you read the book of Galatians, Paul says, I can't believe that you've turned away from the gospel so readily. He said, I don't care if a man or an angel came to you and brought this message. It's not true. The message that you need to become one who is just like the Jewish people in all of their laws in order to be saved. He says, the laws and those regulations do not save you. That is one ditch that people fall into. The other ditch that folks fall into is the ditch of license. And by that I mean, it says, oh, well, I can claim to be a Christian, but I'm not going to actually have Jesus as Lord of my life. I'm going to do whatever sinful things I want to do. And the Corinthian church, if you read through the book of 1 Corinthians, a whole bunch of them claimed that they could live in sexual sin, and they could be worshiping false idols, and they could be drunk most of the time. They could do all these things and claim to be Christians at the same time. He says, what are you doing? What are you doing? A false gospel will promote one of those two things in most cases. It'll fall off the path either to the one side to the right or to the other side to the left. And this rebellious crowd that needs correction is receiving such false teaching, verse 5, so easily. It says you put up with it easily enough, verse 4. They prefer such false teachers to Paul's gospel-centered, humble approach. But Paul asserts that he's not, verse 5, in the least inferior to these super apostles. What he's saying is, you've got these folks who come into town, and they've got stories for you, and they've got teachings for you, and they've got this other view of the gospel for you, and you put up with it easily enough. You seem to think that's wonderful, and you seem to think somehow what I brought to you was inferior, and what they have for you is so wonderful. And he says, what I brought to you is not in the least inferior. In fact, what they are doing is they are deceiving you. And now verse 6, this is interesting. He says, I may not be a trained speaker, but I do have knowledge. We've made this perfectly clear to you in every way. And someone says, oh, what are we talking about with Paul not being a trained speaker? And let's all listen. You know as well as I do that in every generation, there are things that are put forward as the kind of way to get a crowd's heart and the way to manipulate people. And in fact, in some cases, there are, well, I'll just give an example. In at least today's generation, if you want to get people's hearts and really get a hold of them, what you'd want to do, first of all, is dim the lights real good. And then you get some dry ice and some fog machines and have a little fog coming out here. And then somebody steps forward and flatters the people a little bit the way I said, and then gives them some stories about things that lift their spirits. It's things about children and butterflies and puppies. And you've got things that make them cry a little bit and then build them up and they're so excited a little bit. And then finally you shift over to maybe pictures of needy children somewhere. And you say, we need to solve this problem. And the next thing you know, you say, we're going to take up some money. And boy, you know, it does not take that much. There's a formula that you can follow to grab people's hearts. Do you know this? There's a formula that you can use, and there was a formula that they used then, and I'm not sure it involved fog machines, but it involved a lot of stuff with a formula, and this was a trained speaking kind of a way to go. And they said, well, by comparison, the Apostle Paul comes, and he just sort of teaches. And it reminds me of an old algebra class. And these guys come and, oh, they've got stories and they've got all this amazing things. They tell about what wonderful accomplishments they've had and how they can change my life. And, oh, it's wonderful. These guys are really well-trained speakers. And Paul just comes and teaches. And Paul says, okay, I might not be a trained speaker of that variety, but I am teaching you the truth, as you very well know, in my writings and in my coming and talking to you. Now, I need you to understand that Paul is so firm, so animated about these things so far, because what he is doing is he's confronting a deceitful work of a different gospel. This is not about Paul. It's not about him saying, oh, I'm kind of jealous that they're getting your attention. Instead, he's saying, you all are falling into something that isn't Christian faith. And to make it more clear, he says it's really from Satan. You're falling into something that is a different gospel. And that ends the first part of our message. And we go on to the second part, starting at verse 7. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? You see, the financial part of these super apostles, these are ones who are coming into town, and they would say, I'm going to have a big meeting, and now I'm going to be telling you all that what you're getting here, listen, this is sort of like the ones, you hear this on the radio, someone says, I have super secrets about how you can become financially wealthy and independent by buying stocks, flipping homes, you name it. And if only you get in touch with me and get the right teaching and come to my training event and pay the right money, you can learn my amazing secrets as well. And if I said, well, no, I just listen to what Mr. Rojas has to say. Well, what does he know? You pay him anything? You get what you pay for. The fact is, we have deep knowledge that you need to pay for. These super apostles said, we've got deep, deep knowledge. We've got great, great presentations. We need you to kind of pay for this stuff. And Paul says, what I've done, and he's still talking as a father to a rebellious young person, he says, what I did, it's true. I presented what I presented to you free of charge. I brought the gospel message to you without anything that you needed to pay for. This is a principle of gospel ministry, that you bring the preaching of the gospel, particularly where there are new places where the people do not know Christ. You say, I'm going to come here, and as a missionary, I'm going to come and bring this word to you without any gain to me, without you bringing anything where you look like you have to be paying for this, because freely Christ gave, and I am giving freely as well. In doing so, he says he intentionally lowered himself to lift up or elevate those who heard it and believed. You say, well, then how did Paul get along in life? He had to eat. How did he pay for all of these things if he's preaching free of charge? There were two things that he did. Two things. I'm going to share with you each one of them. Verse 8, he says, I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. Let's listen now. It is a principle of missions that when you go to a new place, if you and I were sent to some distant part of the world where nobody knows about Christ, I'm not going to be asking the people of that distant country to be supporting me. Where is my support likely to come from? Where is your support likely to come from? It would come from here, home. Is this right? If we ask Mr. and Mrs. Thummel to go and be sharing the Lord's work in Central Asia, as we have for some years, it is a different church, namely this one, that is providing for their support. Is this right? Paul says, as he went from place to place, there were some churches that got so mature and so stable that they routinely offered their support to him. He said the Macedonian church did this. The Philippian church did this. There are other churches that did this, and he intentionally allowed them to be a support to him, but he said, I never let you, as the Corinth church, do this. You weren't mature enough. You weren't stable enough. I wasn't going to allow anybody to bring the criticism that I was in it for the money. Did you get this? What else did he do? In addition to getting support from other churches, he also worked with his own hands so that he would be burdened to no one. Acts chapter 18 describes how he first came to Corinth. The book of Acts tells us he first arrived in Corinth, and one of the first things he did is he met a husband and wife couple, and they had a business. And their business was the repairing of and making of tents. It would be leather work in those days. Here we have a picture of them. They were doing work like this, and Paul had some training in this craft. You see, it was true then, and should be true now, that any pastor or missionary might have something that he had some skill at to fall back on. something he could teach, something that he was able to do to be able to help. And he had been trained to do work with tent making, and that's what he did. And I want you to hear this. This is important. What he did was that all through the day, he would work as an evangelist, meeting people, sharing Christ with them. He worked as a pastor. He was getting the church established. He was training and discipling people. He did that all day long, and then it got to be night, and everybody else went home and went to bed, and he lit a lamp, and through the night, he worked on piecework, doing things that was going to gain him funds to be able to support himself. He did this through the night, and then through the day, he went back to being a pastor and evangelist, and at night, he would work on this, and he didn't sleep much. He wrote at one point to one of the other churches, and he said he worked night and day so that he would not be a burden to others. This is interesting. He says the way he is gaining his support when he is in Corinth is by supporting himself this way, and then at one point he wrote that he got to get some sleep. He was able to get some sleep because some of the brothers came from another town and brought him some funds as a missionary offering, and for once he was able to sleep. These are the two ways that he was supporting himself. This kind of support, particularly where somebody is working to establish a church as an evangelist and is working at the same time in some other field, is common for those who are establishing new churches. It's the kind of work that I experienced as we were establishing this church. This is common in Christian ministry. Paul had written earlier to the people in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians, and in chapter 9 particularly, someday you can even compare this and note in chapter 9, he writes to them and says, when you get to be a grown-up church, when you get to be mature enough, you will want to be supporting the work of the gospel and supporting those who are preaching the gospel in your midst with financial support from yourselves. He says that's God's ultimate goal when you're mature enough. In fact, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 14, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. That's what a mature church grows up to become, says Paul in 1 Corinthians. But even by 2 Corinthians, which is written later, he says, you still haven't gotten that grown up yet. And I haven't received one penny from you intentionally. Intentionally, I have not received one penny from you. Verse 9, when I was with you and you needed something, I was not a burden to anyone. He says in verse 9, he allowed the church in Macedonia to send him missionary offerings. And he's going to continue to accept offerings from others, but not from Corinth. The only offerings that he would take up in Corinth, and you remember this, he had chapters where he was saying, this is what we're going to do to take up an offering in Corinth. All of it was going to go to the church in Jerusalem, particularly for the needy and the poor in Jerusalem. Not a penny was going to go to Paul. And Paul says he firmly declares he will boast that he hasn't taken a penny from the Christians in Achaia, that's the region where Corinth is. Not a penny, and no one can say otherwise, verse 10. Why is this verse 11? Is it because Paul doesn't care about them? Somebody's going to say, and this is the nature of criticism of pastors, you can't win. Some of them said, yeah, he's no good. He doesn't even take any money. And somebody else would say, oh, no, he's really after your money. And somebody else would say, well, I know what it is. He doesn't even care about you in the first place. And Paul says, why didn't I take no money? Is it because I don't love you? Is the reason that I'm not taking any money because I really don't care about you? He says, of course not. I love you so much, verse 11. So why does he refuse the salary? Why does he refuse an offering when he comes to speak? Why did he refuse a missionary support from them when he's working in other lands? Because it was the opposite of what the greedy super apostles were doing, and he wasn't about to get lumped in with that crowd. He was not about to have an appearance of evil and confuse the new Christians in Corinth. Do you understand this? These people are so new in the faith and so unstable. He says, I don't want to look like one more of these charlatans who's coming in and getting money out of you. I have a different purpose. Paul says, verse 11, that he will cut the ground from under those who want an opportunity to be considered equal with us. Paul will not look like he's even traveling in that pack. Paul will not accept financial support from them. He will from the Philippian church, he will from the Macedonian church, but not a penny from the Corinthian church, because the Corinthian church was at such risk from these false teachers. And that brings us to a word about these false apostles, and this is going to get even firmer. This whole section, chapters 10 and 11 and 12 and 13, are a very firm rebuke of sin and false teaching that's going on in the church. And we get to chapter 11 and verses 13 and 14 and 15, a word about the false apostles. Paul puts it to them straight here. He says, and I want you to look with me, chapter 11, verse 13, he says, "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, masquerading as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light." Ooh, this is interesting. Paul puts it to him this straight. He says these false apostles are men who pretend to be Christian leaders, but they're entirely unaccredited by God. They're bogus imposters. They're deceitful workmen. Their message is deceitful, not the gospel. Their work, what they are building, will not last. They are masquerading as apostles of Christ. They intentionally look and sound like Christians so that they will fool immature Christians. Let's listen to this. Who are these people? These are not the everyday Christians in Corinth. Some of those everyday Christians in Corinth were themselves under Paul's discipline because they were involved in sexual sin, and they were involved in worshiping of idols, and they were involved in various kind of rebellion. But those everyday Christians in Corinth are not the main ones he's thinking about. They themselves are being led astray by a different group, and that different group is a group of so-called super apostles who keep coming into town and saying, we're having another conference, we're having a little bit more of a time where we're going to present some things to you, and we are more interesting and more amazing than the Apostle Paul, they say. And Paul says they're masquerading. That means they have children. It means they put on a mask and they look like they are apostles of Christ, but they're not. Who are they instead? They are ones who are doing great damage to the Church of Jesus Christ. Traveling teachers, they are influencers. They try to gain a following from among the church people. They're puffed up self-promoters. They gladly gain money for their services. They suggest that Paul is unworthy because he has no special letters of recommendation and no special speaking fees. And the young Christians in Corinth are easily fooled. They're easily fooled by this. And Paul says to them something that may sound rather direct, maybe even a little harsh to you, but I need you to understand this. He says to them in verse 11, "And no wonder that they behave this way, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light." What does this mean? It is unusual for Satan to come to you and say, "I'm here to destroy your life. Come follow me and I'm going to ruin everything." Is that the way Satan speaks to you? No, of course not. Satan comes to you and says, "You're wonderful. In fact, if you follow me, you'll be more wonderful. You'll love life more. You'll be even more like God wants you to be. It's going to be great if you come follow me." Satan will put forth that he is helping you, and he will be an angel of light in your eyes, and he will destroy your life. And Paul says these folks who are coming into town are directly agents of Satan, and they make themselves look like angels of light, and it is evil instead. Now, you say, well, what's so harsh about this? Understand this. Is everyone listening? Some folks will appear on TV and use religious words and mention the name of Jesus, and half the world will say, "Oh, they're wonderful." And if you are discerning, you'll say, they're working for Satan. If you say that to someone, "I think they're working for Satan," the people will get angry with you and say, "How can you say that? They seem so nice." But Paul just said it, didn't he? He just said, this is working for Satan, is what it is. It's meant to be a cover-up, a masquerade. Very often people use biblical language and they talk about God, they talk about love, they talk about a brotherhood of all mankind, they make songs about peace, they go on talk shows all about tolerance, and it's all Satan's deception. If instead somebody began to actually preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, they would not tolerate it. How do we see these things happen today? I would say to you, I don't know if I've gone through a year of my adult life when I haven't seen somebody deceived and swept away by some aspect of all of this. I'll give you a few examples. I remember going into the home of a dear grandmother, and this dear lady was receiving literature from a cultic group that claimed that Jesus didn't actually ever live as a man. He never was a person, and just his sort of spirit pervades things. That was their claim. And they had stories and literature and things they would send her, and she thought they were awfully nice and was sending them money, and was being more and more deceived by this. I remember the Christian couple I knew, who began listening to videos by a pastor, originally a Michigan-based pastor, who claimed that Jesus Christ had no judgment in store for anyone, and there wasn't any such hell, and that all of us should know that there's sort of a universal salvation, and there is no need to put any specific trust in Christ, and they became more and more persuaded of this. And they themselves eventually fell away from the Christian faith, and their family exploded, and that particular pastor left the Christian faith and moved to California, where he has a TV show. I'm thinking of the young mother who spends time going on to blogs and posts on the internet, where people who claim to be Christians say that they no longer believe the Bible is true and that God's word is untrustworthy, bringing deep confusion and doubt. I'm fairly confident the ones writing this are not believers, but they continue to claim to be and then pull everyone's faith down. Do you understand where I'm going with this, church? I will tell you that all of that is out there. The way that it works changes. We have more technology to bring these things than we once did. How does Paul handle all of this? The Apostle Paul handles it in this way. For those who are actually in the church, they claim to be members of the church, we know from reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians that he would bring discipline and say, you may not remain in the church and be in this sin or preach this error. And he would, if need be, exclude them from the church if they failed to repent. But what he would do is he'd bring discipline and attempt to restore them. For those who are outside the church but trying to gain influence, these so-called super apostles, they weren't under Paul's direct authority. They weren't members of the church. They were coming in, they would be sort of like the ones talking on the radio. They're not part of the church. They'd be like the ones that are on the internet. They're not part of the church. They're like the ones who are writing books and holding conferences and making music that isn't true. Do you understand this? What Paul does in this case is he confronts the church and says, what are you doing listening to these guys? They are bringing a false gospel. We need to divide ourselves away from this. And he says to them, they are servants of Satan. Don't join them. He gives warnings. And also Paul knows that God will ultimately judge such men. Their work will come to nothing in the end, and they will find their end in hell. Notice what it says in verse 15. He says it's not surprising if Satan's servants masquerade as servants of righteousness. Their end will be what their actions deserve. He says to the church, don't truck with these men. They are headed for hell. And he gives severe warning to the church about this. And that's what he is doing in this chapter. I'm going to give you a word of application, a word of something to ponder for a moment before we go on to the next part of our message. Almost every one of you have access to other voices. They are newscasters. They are videos and books. They are things that are online. Some of them are very appealing. Are they bringing you closer to Christ? Are they bringing the message of the gospel, which is the truth, and are they bringing you closer to Christ? If you spend an evening with this voice, is it something that is pulling down your faith? Is it something that is a neutral distraction? Or is it bringing you closer to Christ? What is this? There are families in this church that have finally said, enough of this. I'm pulling the plug on this TV and I'm getting rid of it. Enough of this. I'm not going to be reading this any longer. This is not bringing me closer to Christ. The Apostle Paul says, what are you filling your mind with? What is this? And that's a great question, isn't it? Those who are putting out those things want to influence you in some way. Is it bringing you closer to Christ? Well, we come to the fourth part of our message, galloping right along, and we come to verse 16. I repeat, let no one take me for a fool, but if you do, then receive me just as you would a fool, so I may do a little boasting. There's the word. Paul warns the people, and as he warns them, he's still talking to them like a parent would to a teenager. The kid thinks some false friend or some spiritual leader is really cool, and there's so many reasons to think that person is really, really cool, and Paul says that he will, in this case, stoop to lining up his ministry against that of the false super apostles, and he will, if he has to, do a little bit of boasting. And what he means by this is, if the teenager says, oh, they're really wonderful, they do this and this and this, and there's so many wonderful things, he says, all right then, if that's what it comes to, I am willing to line up what I do against them so you can see something. And this is not the way that a normal pastor would talk. It's not the way that Jesus Christ would expect us to have to do in a mature church. It's what a rebellious teenager might have to be sort of hit in the face with. I will do, in a way, what they do. They boast about the wonderfulness of who they are. He says, I'm going to tell you something about what I am doing, he says. And he says, I'm sure you'll put up with me in this way because you put up with them well enough, verse 19. You gladly put up with fools since you are so wise. He's speaking ironically here. He's using a little sarcasm. He says, you're so wise, and you know it. You gladly put up with it. Well, so if you're putting up with those others, you'll put up with me for a moment. You put up with anyone, verse 20, who enslaves you with false demands, or exploits you and takes advantage of you for your finances and for your money, or pushes himself forward demanding opportunities to come and speak, or slaps you in the face, flattering and insulting and controlling you. He says, if you're willing to do this with all of them, I guess you can listen to me as well. To my shame, he says, verse 21, I admit we were too weak for that. This is more sarcasm. He says, I guess I was too weak to come and take all your money and too weak to buffalo you into joining my cause. He says, I never did that. But I will tell you about my accomplishments, and I'm going to give you such a list of my boasts, even though it seems, verse 21, like I'm speaking like a fool. A spiritual father should not have to speak this way, but he's going to dare to plunge forward in verse 21, boast of his record. And what we expect, listen, church, what we expect when he says he's going to boast of his record is you might expect him to say, look, I have traveled more miles than they have, and I've planted more churches than they have, and I've won more people to Christ than they have, and I have more friendships among the actual apostles than they do, and I have more people endorse my ministry, and I have more books of the Bible I've written than they have. We're expecting something like that. Is this true? Paul could write a list like that, couldn't he? He could say, I'm a writer of the Bible, and I'm a real apostle, and I've done more than they have. And that's what we expect him to say. And you're going to find that when he gets into this, it's something very different from that. It's very interesting. You expect he might speak the way the big money superstars speak, but we're going to come to something next, the fifth point, about weakness instead. And he is going to speak primarily about his weakness. Paul starts with some basics to get this cleared up, verse 22 and 23. The apostles, these so-called super apostles, apparently came from Israel and made much of the fact that they were maybe closer to Jesus, closer to the actual apostles because they were from Israel, and they were Hebraic, meaning that they spoke the Hebrew language as their first language rather than as their second or third language. They weren't Hellenistic, they weren't mainly Greek-speaking, and they were really special and so on. And so Paul says, verse 22, are they Hebrews, these false teachers that you think so much about? So am I. Are they Israelites? Do they have a history of living right in Israel? So did I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? And at that point, I think the answer would be probably not. They're servants of Satan, actually. But he says, I am more. I am more a servant of Christ than they are. And we come to the place where he begins boasting. And the first thing, verse 23, is a general account of his suffering. Rather than saying, I wrote more books of the Bible and had more amazing things happen, he begins with a list of his general sufferings. Verse 23, he says, I have worked much harder. By that he means, I stayed awake all night sewing tents. While they were having vacations on the Riviera, I was not built up. I didn't appear in all the magazines. I wasn't featured on someone's talk show. I was working all night. And I didn't sleep. I've been in prison more frequently. That's a really good thing. I mean, you know, whenever you have a special speaker coming, you'd want to know that he's been in prison lots. I have been flogged more severely. He says, I have been condemned in every town I went to, unlike these others. I have been exposed to death again and again. And then we come to a list of specific sufferings. That's what my notes say, specific sufferings. It's not easy to say. But he says, I'm going to give you this list of specific sufferings. And this is what my boast is. My boast is not that I've had all of these wonderful accomplishments. My boast is in my weakness. The first of them. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. What does this mean? He says, when I would come into a new town, I would first go to the synagogue and I would say, Jesus is Lord. He's the Messiah, the one that we were expecting. It was Jesus. And he said 5 different times up till this point, 5 different times, the Jewish people grabbed him and took him into a back room and said, this is blasphemy, and got a hold of a whip that was meant to tear the flesh. And their own law allowed that you could whip somebody up to 40 times. And they usually made it 1 less time just so that they wouldn't lose count or do something wrong and offend God. It's interesting to me how closely they wanted to not offend God by beating the one who was bringing the message from God. Do you understand this? And so 5 different times they would have done something that would have left permanent scars on his body. If you had been able to take the robe off the Apostle Paul, there would be by then 195 lash marks all around his body. Is there anyone in this room who after the second time that happened says, I want to keep going? Paul says that's already happened to me 5 times. I have suffered in this way. Moreover, 3 times, he says in verse 25, I was beaten with rods. This was the Roman method. If the Jews did this at their synagogues with the whips, the Romans said, we don't like you, and what we're going to do is we are going to take some long rods that will do physical damage to the interior of your body and will beat you indiscriminately without any number of counts to this thing. It would have brought internal bleeding and bruising and broken bones and organ damage. He said, that's happened to me 3 times now already. And then he says, once I was stoned. We know about this. The book of Acts tells us about a time Paul was in a town called Lystra. Jewish people were so offended, they dragged him out of town, and they took up rocks, and they began throwing rocks at him until he was dead or nearly so. He may well have died and been restored, but I can tell you this, when you're stoning somebody, you aim at the front and at the top, at the head, and he was stoned to death, and as much as he had marks on his body from the whips and from the rods, I have to believe he had permanent marks from being stoned. How could your face not have marks from such? 3 times I was shipwrecked, he says. This is interesting. You and I have read about, at the end of the book of Acts, a tremendous shipwreck where the ship crashed on the island of Malta and he and the others barely escaped. Do you remember this? The interesting thing about this is at the point that Paul is writing this, it's before that shipwreck ever happened. In other words, already by the time he's written this, in his travels, in order to serve Christ, 3 times he has been in a shipwreck. And you say, well, maybe it wasn't so much. The ship hit a little rock and they all offloaded. And he says, well, once, connected to one of those shipwrecks, he spent a night and day in the open sea, which is a way of saying on one of those shipwrecks, I clung to some of the debris and was 24 hours in what I would take to be the Mediterranean until somebody scooped him up. Verse 26, I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers and dangers from bandits. Travel was harder in those days. If you got on ships and knew, see, here's the thing. How many of you, if you got on a plane, and the plane crashed and you barely made it out with your life, and then you got on another plane and the plane crashed and you barely made it out with your life, and then a third time the plane crashed and you barely made it out with your... How many of you would keep flying? This is what he was doing every time he got on board ship. Travel was difficult and ships sank. You say, well, then I'd walk. He did that, but there were problems with that. As you walked along, it would be springtime and the river would be flooded and the bridge would be out and you would have some perilous way to cross the river which would be at risk of your life. Is everyone with me on this so far? And you say, oh, I crossed the river. That's terrific. Now you're going up through a mountain pass, and there are bandits on either side of the road, and they're accosting various travelers. You say, did that happen much? What was the Good Samaritan all about? That was a normal thing. You're off by yourself. There's no way to dial 911 and get the state police there, and somebody beats you senseless and takes everything you have. And he says, I was in danger that way on every trip. I was in danger from my own countrymen, verse 26, and in danger from the Gentiles. You see, the Gentiles hated the Jews. And he would show up as a Jew, and they felt like that they ought to kill him because he was a Jew. Meantime, he could have at least gone into the Jewish community and been sort of safe there, but he would say, I'm here to tell you about Jesus, and they would try to beat and kill him. He was in danger in both settings. In danger in the country, in danger at sea, every time he traveled. In danger from, and this is interesting, all of the ones up until now were sort of this kind of sing-songy thing. I'm in danger on the road, I'm in danger from the rivers, I'm in danger from the Jews, I'm in danger from the Gentiles, I'm in danger in the country, I'm in danger at sea. He said, now I'm going to get to the one thing that I'm not even going to pair up with something because it's more dangerous than everything I've mentioned so far. In danger from false brothers. These false teachers who are coming to try to steal away your heart and to try to bring damage to me in my ministry is a way bigger damage than shipwrecks, a way bigger danger than any of these other things that I've mentioned yet so far, these false brothers. Most of you, if you knew an airline had terrible, terrible ratings and crashed every third or fourth flight, would say, I'm never going to get on that plane. And Paul says, the danger of false messages that you're going to see on TV is more dangerous to you than bad airplanes. Did you understand that? Did everybody hear that? The danger of the false message you're going to get on TV is going to be worse for you than if you got on Aeroflot. It's going to be worse for you than any bad airline. The danger from false brothers. He says, I have labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. We already heard about that, didn't we? Working as a tent maker by night, working as a missionary pastor by day, going without sleep for the cause of Christ. No luxury or glamour in this. He says, I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. Being undernourished was normal in his life. I have been cold and naked, verse 27. And that's not just because he was underdressed because of the cold, but he was often imprisoned. And it was intentional to take away warm things and to make people really, really suffer from cold. And he had done that. This is Paul's resume. It's the opposite of the bragging about the super apostles. But he says that's not really his greatest trial. Look at verse 28. It's not the beatings, it's not the prison. It's the daily pressure of my concern for all the churches. He says, I could easily put up with starving to death and being imprisoned and being beaten senseless, but I have this burden spiritually for whether the people of the church are going to live for Christ, and that is the greatest burden of all of them. Can I tell you something? You will know when you have a real pastor when he says, all I care about is the ministry of the gospel of Christ and how these dear people are doing spiritually. I look sometimes at resumes from various ones who claim to be spiritual leaders, and they talk about how in demand they are as speakers and how much they really enjoy the writing of books and how they're really being exalted by various ones. And then you look a little further and it tells about what they do with their lives. And they tell about how they go parasailing and how they take up various hobbies and they're interested in cheese making and they have exotic dogs and they do these things. And I think, did the Apostle Paul spend time with these hobbies? Did he have time to throw away on stuff? What did he care about? The ministry of Jesus Christ and suffering for the souls of people coming to Jesus and opposing false things. Am I right? You will know you're dealing with an actual pastor who loses sleep over the condition of other people's souls and has known what it is to suffer for the cause of Christ. Paul says that's what he's doing, and he's not even going to put up all of his accomplishments. He instead puts a list of his weaknesses. He puts up a list of his sufferings. He says, verse 29, who is weak and I do not feel weak? Helpless and burdened. You see, he looks at people he's burdened for and he says, no! You! Don't do that! I feel helpless to stop you. I mean, it's wrong. Don't do this. I feel as weak as you do because, I can't make anyone in this room follow Christ. And I want to shout sometimes, don't do that! But I'm weak and helpless to stop anyone. And he says, that's how I feel. Who is led into sin, who doesn't, and I do not inwardly burn with shame for such sin and indignation towards those who are causing that sin. I think, this one's being dragged into sin by that one. It's awful. Paul says, that's what I feel. This is where Paul's heart is, where Paul hurts. This is Paul's boast, not of his strength, but of his weakness, of his dependence on God in the face of suffering. Could you follow a shepherd like that? That's what Paul is offering. We get to the last part of our message, which is relatively short. I'm at verse 30. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Someone will doubt that Paul could have lived through all that he said. And they would say, well, I don't know if all those things he just said were true, all those shipwrecks and beatings, whatever. And he says in verse 31, I assure you before God, I am not lying. Someone would say, well, I don't know if it's even something where somebody ought to think that he's an apostle if he suffered all these different things and, he thinks his weakness is worth boasting about. Paul says, I assure you, I am not lying. These things are true. And as a way of explaining his emphasis on personal weakness and dependence on Christ, Paul recalls a specific incident in his early life, his early Christian life, that is, verse 32. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of Damascus guarded in order to arrest me. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. Somebody might say, now wait a minute, we had all these things about how Paul has been beaten and imprisoned and was starving. And then he sort of culminates the whole thing with going over the wall in a basket. What's this all about? But it's not that hard to understand. I'll tell you what this is. He says that he came to Damascus when he was at first searching to destroy the church, to destroy Christ. He was kind of proud. He had armed soldiers with him, and he had all kinds of things going on. Jesus confronted him. He became a believer. He went into Damascus, and after not many days started preaching the gospel. The people there wanted to kill him right away. I mean, before his ministry even got started, they were ready to kill him. And the governor of the town said, put a guard at every one of the doors of this town, every gate, so he can't get out. We'll make sure he doesn't get out. And then next we'll go on a house-to-house search. We'll find him. We'll kill him. That'll be the end of him. Paul had come there to arrest others and to do things, and he was now a wanted man himself. And one night, the few Christians who were there smuggled him into a dark room that had a window that went down out the city wall. And they said, for your own safety, we're going to smuggle you out of this place. And they put him in a basket, and at night, they lowered him down out of the city. And he escaped. This illustration from his own life is so powerful because of the transformation that he received there at Damascus. And I'm going to show you two pictures to help you see the transformation. When he was going into town, he was horses and swordsmen and authority and riches and power, and he was full of himself, and he knew what he was doing, and he was quite a guy. That's what he was doing going into town. Am I right? Not many days or weeks later, on the way out of town, he was stuffed in a basket and was entirely helpless and was dependent only on God. Do you see the transformation? He says, I had that big change in my life. I went from being somebody who was all about me, in charge of me, to somebody who was completely dependent on the Lord and was being lowered down in a basket. He says, that's an expression of the kind of weakness that God has brought me to. And as we think about some application, two things. This is the kind of shepherd that God would call us to follow. Not the proud and self-driven type, but the one who is dependent on the Lord and can only boast of his weakness rather than what he himself is accomplishing. And that's the kind of Christian God would call us to be, not the proud, self-driven, I know what I want and I'll do it myself type, but the one who is weak enough to be entirely dependent on the Lord. Paul says that's what he is and calls us to be as well. You see, it's the kind that says to the Lord, you are my strength when I am weak. That's where this thing goes. And in fact, as a kind of an expression or response to the Lord, I wonder if you'd take your little hymn sing booky-doo, and we are going to, all of us right now, go back to that song. It's somewhere in there. You are my strength when I am weak. You are the treasure that I seek. You are my all in all. And we're going to do this, just us chickens singing this together. We're not even going to stand up yet. We're going to just try it just this way. Somebody's going to say, this is going to be really bad. That is outstanding.